Welcome. Thank you for coming, everyone, tonight. And I'm sorry for the delay. A lot of people were caught in traffic, and also we had a crisis in the car park downstairs, so we had to wait for that as well. But you're all very welcome. So, just a couple of housekeeping bits. There are books at the back there, Tony's books, which can be picked up at the end if anyone feels that they want. I think they're 15 euros per book. And when we start with the questions, I'm going to hand out a couple of sheets. These things, so if anyone is not on either the AAW or the CPSC newsletters, you can put your email address in here. Okay, so this has been, I'm going to welcome Tony. I'm delighted to welcome him to Cork. We're very honoured to have him. Sorry. This is the book that he wrote. It's an entirely academic book, filled with references and documentation. A solid piece of work, and it details the Zionist collaboration with the Nazis during World War II and prior to World War II. So it's controversial stuff, but it's very, very thoroughly documented. I'm just going to go through a couple of basic ideas as to why we looked to present this stuff. This is, after all, we're going to be going through history, largely. A couple of people have said to me in the past, what's the relevance of history when we're watching a live stream genocide? So I just want to sort of address that particular question, because I think it's a good question and I think it needs to be addressed. So, as most of us know, the Zionist state is predicated on US primarily and European power, and it would not survive without that power. And part of the Zionist project is also predicated on this, what I'm going to call a mythic connection to the Nazi genocide, the Holocaust. So the state of Israel continues to rely upon this myth to provide justification for its ongoing genocide of Palestinians and other people in the region. Up until last year, this was a relatively slow genocide. Obviously, there's been a radical shift in Israeli politics, and it has become an extraordinarily fast genocide at this point. I think, to a great extent, Israel is largely forgiven on an unconscious level in Europe and America for its perpetration of atrocities, by the fact that there's a lot of Western guilt around the Holocaust, and also by the idea that the Israeli population is driven by a kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome. I think both of these things are misdirected in that, I mean, obviously the West does have a tremendous amount of guilt, and that guilt is well placed. But as we'll look at tonight, it's not the Zionists who suffered in the Holocaust. It was the Jewish population. So eroding the connection between the state of Israel and the Nazi genocide, I think, is going to be essential over the next few years to dissolving what I see as a kind of an inverted soft power that the Israeli state exerts on the West. So looking to cut that connection that the Israeli state continually rubs in everybody's face, that connection to the Holocaust. So just to keep in mind, the Zionist ideology itself and the Zionists, largely speaking, were not victims of a Nazi genocide. On the whole, and in some cases in very pronounced ways, they collaborated with the Nazis. Zionism itself has benefited hugely, both economically and politically, from the Holocaust, from the Nazi Holocaust. And the Zionists themselves ensured that many, many more Jews were sacrificed during the Holocaust than needed to be sacrificed. So the idea that what we're going to be talking about, the historical context of Zionism, the idea that this is an irrelevance at this stage, I think is to misunderstand the nature of unaddressed history. Because unaddressed history continually manipulates the present. Okay, the last thing I'll say about it is that this is a history which will also demonstrate that the Holocaust as such was basically a class struggle. It was not a struggle between different races or even different religions, even though the Nazis certainly did have a pure race culture, but the struggle that emerged from the Holocaust and from everything that happened during that time was very linked to class. And you'll see again and again examples of wealthy Jewish Zionists saving their own skins, basically, and throwing their fellow colleagues in their religion under the bus, so to speak. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Tony. I'd like you all to give him a round of applause for coming here.
Thank you. I always like to get the applause in first, because afterwards it might not be so enthusiastic. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Cork PSC, for inviting me. Just a little about my background. I was brought up in an Orthodox religious Zionist family. My father was a rabbi, and I grew up with all the myths about Israel as a democratic state, an island of socialism even. Within the Middle Eastern capitalism, the kibbutzim were held up as a paragon of virtue, and we were told that the Arab refugee problem, they were never Palestinians, that word was never uttered, was because they had been ordered out of Palestine by the Arab regimes in order that they could invade on May the 15th, 1948. The Nakba, of course, was not part of the vocabulary. Some of you, I think, attended Rashid Khalidi's lecture last night, and Rashid Khalidi was the first scholar to actually look at the broadcasts from the Arab radio stations and the CIA and the BBC, and he found that not only were there no orders to the Palestinians to exit, on the contrary, they were told to stay put where they were. But these myths gained ground, of course, and they were fed and they were sustained, and a whole myth of narratives grew up around it, and that is how Israel justified its existence. But in the past, I mean, Israel had and was seen as some kind of shining light. I think today that kind of moral righteousness has been stripped from it. People can see very clearly that it is a genocidal state. The West, the United States in particular, but Britain and Europe, have completely disregarded international law. It's as if the whole legal architecture that was erected after World War II has simply disappeared. The ICC, which had no hesitation in issuing arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin, is still hesitating about issuing them against Netanyahu and Gallant, despite the overwhelming evidence. And we understand why. With Trump coming into power, he sanctioned, I think, the ICC last time, so they will be doubly afraid. So we've seen, in the sense, the collapse of what passed for international law as regards Israel. Israel is supported not because it's a Jewish state, whatever that means. It's supported because the United States and Western imperialism sees it as in its interest to have a watchdog, an armed watchdog, that can impose its will in the Middle East, an oil-rich area, a very strategically important area, and I think we should bear that in mind. Now, having said all of that, I then want to proceed, really. There's a lot of confusion about what Zionism is. For many people, Zionism is something Jewish. And most people don't realise that the antecedents of Jewish Zionism today were in Christian Zionism, which predated Jewish Zionism by about 4 centuries. It was a product of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and so on. It was a Protestant theology that held that the Jews in Europe should return to somewhere they'd never been, which was Palestine. Whereas the Catholics, and I suspect most people here are born into the Catholic religion, always held that it was their followers who were the direct successors of the children of Israel. So there was a very sharp, if you like, theological division between Catholicism and Protestantism, which was really, of course, the religion of capitalism and colonialism. And you see that today. The most avid Zionists are Christian Zionists, Christians United for Israel in America, that has over 1 million supporters. The Republican right are the most enthusiastic supporters of Israel because they know what Israel represents. And that really is simply a fact. So Christian Zionism predated in theological terms, and then in the 19th century you had people like Lord Shaftesbury and Palmerston, who was the British Prime Minister, trying to persuade the border deputies of British Jews that the Jews should return, and the border deputies refused. In 1838 they established a British consulate in Jerusalem, which was headed by a man named William Young, who was the protector of the Jews. 1840, Shaftesbury approached the border deputies about supporting the return of Jews to Palestine. In 1842, not one single word about the current genocide. It's been an institute which has entertained all sorts of neo-Nazis, racist, fascist, you name it, because it's also a diplomatic look, well, in the words of one Israeli academic, Daniel Blattman, it's a diplomatic laundromat to whitewash the various racist criminals that abound in this world. I mean, the first one who visited was John Vorster, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa, if you remember, who was interned during the war because of his pro-Nazi sympathies. But he's not alone. Bolsonaro, who declared he was a Hitler lover, Rodriguez Duterte of the Philippines, but there are many others as well. So the lessons that Zionism has drawn are very different ones. And I want to quote, and just give me, if I can give this to you to just hold. Yeah, it's from Yehuda Alkner. He was a child survivor of Auschwitz. He was very, very lucky, actually, because children usually were exterminated first off in Auschwitz. But he came on the last train, deportation train to Auschwitz, which was left at the back in the siding and was forgotten about. And by that time they were demolishing the gas chambers, so he survived. He was extremely fortunate. But he became rector of the Central European University in Budapest. That is before Netanyahu's anti-Semitic friend Viktor Orban evicted them. And he wrote a very famous article in Haaretz, which is a relatively liberal Israeli language, English language newspaper, the only one, incidentally. And he spoke of a profound existential angst fed by a particular interpretation of the lessons of the Holocaust, that we are the eternal victim. In this ancient belief, I see the tragic and paradoxical victory of Hitler. Two nations, metaphorically speaking, emerged from the ashes of Auschwitz. A minority will assert this must never happen again, and a frightened and haunted majority who assert this must never happen to us again. And he went on, but I won't quote any further. I think you get the message that the way Zionism has interpreted the lessons of the Holocaust is such that it can perpetrate another, or in the words of Gideon Levy, who's a journalist on Haaretz, one of the best, one of the very few good journalists in Israel, when he says Gaza, Auschwitz should be a warning to us, but instead Gaza is justified because of Auschwitz. So it's a very similar motive. And what was the record during the Holocaust itself? I said that the aim of Zionism, the goal of Zionism, was to achieve a Jewish state. And during the Second World War, the Zionists really did not want to know about the Holocaust. They didn't even admit to it for a very long time, and then only reluctantly, because they feared that rescue efforts, raising funds for those who were trapped inside Europe, would detract from the major task. The major task was building for a Jewish state, not rescuing the Jews of Europe, who in essence they'd written off. I mean, their only attempts at rescue were really of their own comrades in the Zionist movement inside Europe. And Ben-Gurion came out with a quote, and again I'll just go to it. This was a speech to Mapai, that's the Israeli Labour Party's Central Committee, on the 9th of December 1938. Now, those of you who have some awareness of history might recall that in the previous month there occurred the Nazi pogrom of Kristallnacht. And that had, major reverberations throughout Europe. Virtually every synagogue in Germany was burnt down. Jewish shops had their glass smashed, hence the term Kristallnacht, night of broken glass. About 100 Jews were killed, and 30,000 were put in the concentration camps. And the move grew up. People started to realise that the Jews of Germany were in danger of their lives, and the British government offered to take 10,000 Jewish children. And what was David Ben-Gurion's response? Ben-Gurion was the first Prime Minister of Israel and then chair of the Jewish Agency, which was a state in the making. And he said in a speech, if I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to Eretz Yisrael, then I would opt for the second alternative, for we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel. In other words, building up the state, the history of the people of Israel, this concept of the ancient people of Israel, which is perpetuated via statehood, was more important to him than saving individual Jewish children's lives. And that was not uncommon. Ben-Gurion, you can read really in the official biography of Ben-Gurion by Shabtai Tabet, The Burning Ground. The last chapter, Disaster Means Strength, and what that means is, that's a quote, is that the disaster of the Holocaust meant strength for the Zionist movement. And Ben-Gurion went on in a memo to the Zionist executive of the 17th of December about the dilemma Zionism faced, which was that the energy of people trying to rescue Jews would fatally undermine the Zionist movement, whose task was to build a Jewish state. And he said, if the Jews are faced with a choice between the refugee problem and rescuing Jews from concentration camps on the one hand, and aid for the National Museum in Palestine on the other, the Jewish sense of pity will prevail, and our people's entire strength will be directed at aid for the refugees in the various countries. Zionism will vanish from the agenda, and indeed not only world public opinion in England and America, but also from Jewish public opinion. We are risking Zionism's very existence if we allow the refugee problem to be separated from the Palestine problem. And what this meant in practice was they only supported the rescue of Jewish refugees if the destination was Palestine, because they wanted to break open the immigration barriers that the British had imposed with the 1939 White Paper. So you have many examples of where Zionists simply sabotaged and obstructed rescue efforts of others, like Rabbi Dr. Solomon Schonfeld, who was the chief of the Chief Rabbi's Rescue Committee in Britain, because as far as he was concerned, rescue to anywhere was better than dying in Europe. But the Zionists did not see it that way, because in their minds, their rationale was, what is the point of a Jewish state if when the time comes, people are not rescued by it? And even worse, if they go anywhere else, anti-Semitism will reoccur, because anti-Semitism is a product of non-Jewish hostility, so it's futile. It is better to suffer now than forsake the creation of a Jewish state. That was their logic, if you can call it such. So I think really I've really finished much of what I have to say. As I say, Israel, I think, it is clear that the far right are in charge, and to be quite honest, people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who are two senior cabinet ministers, are really, I wouldn't even say they're neo-Nazis, they're just Jewish Nazis. Their attitude to Arabs, Itamar Ben-Gvir has gone on marches where the slogan is death to the Jew, death to the Arabs, which the slogan in Europe, in Poland and Germany, was death to the Jews. There is really no difference. Their hatred of Arabs goes before it. So Israel, when the West supports Israel, it doesn't do it because of the Jews. It does it because of its own material interests. And I think that's what we have to bear in mind. And the question is how we undermine that support and force our governments into withdrawing their support for genocide at this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. That was great. So we'll have a Q&A. I just want to ask you a couple of questions of the 100-odd questions I have here for you. The first one I thought is, could you just talk a little bit about Shlomo Sand and his work? I'm particularly interested in the idea of busting open some of the myths that have come down to us. And just for those who might not know, Shlomo Sand is an Israeli archaeohistorian, and his work was focused on this whole idea of whether or not there was an exodus, whether or not there was an exile from Israel after the Jewish revolt of 63 AD, because these myths are central to the idea of the Jewish return to Palestine. So yeah, I wonder if you could just talk about that for a minute.
Thanks. I'm not an expert in Shlomo Sand. I've read a couple of his books, but he's essentially correct. I think the Jewish revolt was AD 130, Bar Kokhba, and the temple was destroyed in about 70 AD. It was a lesser revolt, but there is no evidence that there was the Jews were expelled. The Romans generally didn't expel native populations. What had happened was that throughout the centuries under Greek, with the Greek Empire and so on, that Jews had migrated and become traders, and there were large Jewish communities, something like 500,000 in Alexandria, and there were other Jewish communities dotted around the Middle East, so that there had already been a quite voluntary exodus, because the Jews had become traders, and merchantmen, just like the Phoenician and many other peoples had in the past. It was nothing unusual. Those Jews who stayed behind were mainly pastoralists, farmers, and the majority of them would have converted to Christianity and then 600-700 to Islam. It was a quite natural process, but for the purposes of Zionism, then of course you have the myth of the 2,000 years, but it isn't accurate, of course.
Excellent. And just to add to that, when the Arabs first, when the Muslims first took over, went into Jerusalem and took Jerusalem from the Byzantine, the Christian Byzantines, there was no Jewish quarter in Jerusalem at that stage. Okay. The second thing you might talk about quickly is, so 1933, the Nazis come to power. There is a world Jewish boycott on Nazi goods, on German goods, and that gets the German economy screaming, and the Nazis are close to collapse. And I just want you to talk a little bit about why the Nazis didn't collapse.
Sorry, let me just... I'm going to have to turn this off and turn it down. Right, can I just... Yeah, I mean, when Hitler came to power on January the 30th, 1933, the instinctive reaction of most Jews was to boycott Nazi Germany, that is, not to buy anything German. At first it was an unorganised protest, but by March, with the elections, it started to become organised. But the Zionists were very much opposed to it, because they believed not in fighting anti-Semitism, but dealing with it. And they saw that the advent of the Nazis was extremely profitable for them, to put it bluntly. Can I just... I've got a couple of quotes, if you can just hold that up. I'm quoting from The Modern Foundations of Israel by Noah Lucas, or the late Noah Lucas, who was a lecturer at Sheffield University. He's a critical Zionist historian, but he is a Zionist. And he wrote, as the European Holocaust erupted, Ben-Gurion saw it as a decisive opportunity for Zionism. Ben-Gurion, above all others, sensed the tremendous possibilities inherent in the dynamic of the chaos and carnage in Europe. In conditions of peace, Zionism could not move the masses of world Jewry. The forces unleashed by Hitler, in all their horror, must be harnessed to the advantage of Zionism. By the end of 1942, the struggle for a Jewish state became the primary concern of the movement. In fact, it wasn't by the end of 1942. In May 1942, the Zionists held a major conference, the Biltmore Conference, at the Biltmore Hotel in New York. And their demands were, for the first time ever, for a Jewish state. They'd always hinted it beforehand. They'd always talked about a Jewish home and so on, but never a Jewish state. But for the first time, they came out in favour of a Jewish state. There was absolutely no mention of Jewish refugees or the plight of Jews under Nazi occupation, etc. They were solely concerned with that. And then, if you go on, on June the 21st, the Zionist Federation in Germany wrote to Hitler, although they never got a reply. But it's interesting what they wrote. And they said, on the foundation of the new state, which has established a principle of race, fruitful activity for the fatherland is possible. And that was their attitude. So you can read the whole letter. It's in Lucy Davidovitz's Holocaust Reader. But they also say that the boycott of Nazi Germany was un-Zionist. They wanted to trade, they wanted to do business they didn't want to boycott. So when the boycott movement was at its height and it was doing damage to German exports, because it was an export-led economy, the Zionists stepped in with their offer of Havara, which was a trading agreement. In essence, Jews in Germany, rich Jews, would have their money frozen. They would go to Palestine with £1,000 equivalent, which meant they could enter without a visa or a certificate, as it was called. And then they could buy with their marks in Germany, German industry and various things which would be exported to Palestine. This broke the boycott because the Zionists were not interested in fighting Hitler, but in actually using the rise of the Nazis to the maximum possible extent. So between 1933 and 1939, 60% of the capital investment in the Jewish economy in Palestine came from Nazi Germany. So if you say that Hitler was responsible for building Israel, you wouldn't be far wrong. But of course, his successes in the German state, I mean, people say that it's because of guilt. I don't accept that at all. The German state has been involved in the Armenian Holocaust. They were present, they were in alliance with Turkey at the time. There's the Namibian, Southwest Africa Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, of course, and now the Holocaust in Gaza. So the fact is that the German state doesn't seem to have much of a problem with genocide and Holocausts, and their position today really reflects that. But the Zionists, I say in August 1933, agreed Havara, the transfer agreement it was called. Such was the uproar in the worldwide Jewish community at this, that at their conference in Prague, they couldn't approve it. They had to lie and say that Bill Locker, the executive member, denied they had anything to do with it because it was so unpopular. And they had to wait 2 years later to the Lucerne Conference, the World Zionist Congress, before they could approve it. Though, of course, in practice, they had negotiated it with the German Zionist Federation with Arthur Rupin from the Zionist Executive.
Tony, could you just explain again about the transfer of funds to Palestine from Germany during the boycott, just mechanics of it? They didn't quite catch that.
Yeah, well, they set up 2 companies. One was Paltrue Limited.
Can you explain the background again about freezing of funds, etc.?
Yes, well, if you were well off, your funds would be frozen. I mean, this was happening all the time in Germany, don't forget. And your funds would be used. You would be allowed £1,000 in foreign currency, so you could travel abroad and enter Palestine. And then secondly, your frozen marks, the spear marks I think they were called, would be used to buy from German industry goods which would then be exported to Palestine. So no hard currency, at least initially, was involved. But what it meant was that the wheels of the German economy kept turning because there was this demand for them. But it clearly, if you were campaigning for a boycott of German goods and Palestine was being swamped by them, you were breaking the boycott. And not only that, but they extended Havara to the rest of the Middle East because they couldn't get rid of them all in Palestine. So they were in essence the marketing agent for Nazi Germany's economy. And clearly that broke the boycott. But the Zionist movement took a decision that combating Hitler was more important was less important rather than building a Jewish state. And one has to bear in mind that there is a distinct possibility that the Hitler regime could have been overthrown in the winter of 1933. It was very, very shaky, and many observers, the Investors' Review, for example, thought it was unlikely it would survive. But Havara, in a sense, guaranteed its stability. The book to read is Edwin Black, who's a right-wing Zionist, but his research is fairly remarkable. The transfer agreement, which I advise, it's about 400 pages, and it is well worth ordering, and it will give much greater detail than I'm able to give you now. Yeah.
Okay, last question. So, you were on a panel a couple of weeks ago, and you were talking about the two-state solution. So in the interests of continuing on myth busting, I would argue that the two-state solution has been promoted by the West primarily to allow Israel to continue its slow genocide. Anyway, I thought you spoke very strongly on it, and I thought maybe you'd give some comments on both what you think of the two-state solution and also what you think of us as activists against this malevolent entity in the Middle East, on our attitude and what we should be pushing for in relation to the two-state solution.
Yeah, well, I mean, I resigned from Palestine Solidarity Campaign in 1993, and I was one of the founders of it because they supported the Oslo Accords. The idea that Zionism is going to give part of its patrimony back to the indigenous population is completely absurd. Settler colonialism doesn't do that kind of thing, and Zionism certainly doesn't. The Oslo Accords actually didn't talk about a Palestinian state, but the idea of a two-state solution has just been a kind of smokescreen for continuing colonisation, nothing more. At best it would be a Bantustan, but in reality what Israel today is doing is trying to engineer the ethnic cleansing both of Gaza and the West Bank. So those who give any sustenance to two states are giving sustenance to an apartheid solution in Palestine, which is not going to happen, and they're only aiding the Zionists in the process. So I think that's really all I've got to say.
So I'm going to bring this out to the middle if anyone wants to ask any questions. Okay, that's easy. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Tony. So I think I know most people, but my name is Anne. I'm McShane in the Cove Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So I haven't read your book, Tony, but I want to buy it. But I have heard you speak, and I've read what you've written. So one thing that makes me uncomfortable, and maybe I'm meant to be uncomfortable, is the idea of the leaders, or perhaps the self-appointed leaders of the Jewish people in Germany and other parts of Europe, kind of cooperating, or kind of de facto cooperating with the Nazis in their annihilation of the Jewish people, because for them the need to create, or their project of creating a state, a Jewish state, was more important, or that even more than that, the fact of the genocide was useful in order to drive people into their arms. So I suppose my question to you is it not simply that it was a coincidence between the two projects? Do you see it as more than that? So I have lots more questions, but the other question, just one more, sorry, Jonathan, it's just that, I wondered to myself, what is anti-Semitism? And from that point of view, what was it that you're saying that the Zionists agreed with the anti-Semites about? Because you said that they agreed with them that the Jewish people would never fit in, but then you went on to say something like that they agreed with them in relation to some of the things that they didn't like themselves about Jewish people, and which would be kind of sorted out, that they would be cleansed of when they went to Israel. Okay, thank you.
No.
Well, anti-Semitism is very simple, which is hostility, hatred, discrimination towards Jews because they're Jews. And part of that is the belief that Jews do not belong in the societies where they live. So Wilhelm Marr, who popularised the term anti-Semitism, did it on the basis that there's such a thing as Semites, which was wrong because it's a linguistic definition, and he characterised the Jews of Europe as Semites who belonged in the Middle East. and not where they were living in Germany. So that, in essence, was what anti-Semitism was about. So there was a congruence of interest, if you like. The anti-Semites didn't believe Jews should be in Germany, and the Zionists didn't either. And let me quote. Alfred Rosenberg, you might have heard of. He was a senior Nazi. He was head of the East and the Ost territories. He was hanged at Nuremberg, and he was the main Nazi theoretician. And he wrote in 1919 that Zionism must be vigorously supported in order to encourage a significant number of German Jews to leave for Palestine and other destinations. And that was the view amongst the SS in particular, which was in charge of Jewish policy. So the attitude of the anti-Semites was absolutely clear. The Zionists in Germany, up to 1939, were the favoured Jews. None of the Zionist organisations had been banned from 1936. Zionist organisations were allowed to meet and to organise until 1939. It didn't do them any good in the end. They still ended up in the concentration camps and Auschwitz, etc. But throughout Europe, the leadership of the Judenrat, the Jewish councils, 2/3 of them, according to Isaiah Trunk, who's written the most comprehensive history of the Judenrat, the Jewish councils, were Zionist. And not because they were evil. I mean, they formed the kind of part of the leadership of the Jewish communities, and their politics were those of the bourgeoisie. I mean, there were small elements of the left, the Hashamat, and so on, but actually some of them came to Israel after the Warsaw Ghetto. For instance, Chaj Klinger, which I quote in my book, was extremely bitterly critical of the role of the Zionists in the Judenrat. The Jewish councils were set up to facilitate extermination. Israel Shahak, who was a distinguished professor of organic chemistry at Hebrew University and an anti-Zionist. He was also a child survivor of both the Warsaw Ghetto and Belsen-Bergen. He wrote that during the main action, the main deportations between, I think it was July and September 1942, you hardly saw any German soldiers. The rounding up of Jews, the winkling out of Jews, even from perfectly good hiding places, was done by the Jewish police at the instruction of the Jewish council. And so when Hannah Arendt wrote her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, about the 61 Eichmann trial, she was pilloried. She had been a quasi-Zionist. I mean, she was really hovered between two poles. She said if there had been no Jewish leadership in Europe, if they'd been disorganised, there would have been plenty of misery, but far more Jews would have survived. It was because of the leadership of the Jewish communities and the way they organised that the Nazis were so efficient. For example, I've written an open letter on my blog, and you're welcome to subscribe, to the rector of Delft University in the Netherlands. I was recently invited by students to speak there, but the university banned me because I was a danger to their students. I don't quite know what I was a danger to, but anyway, we decided I would speak anyway, and I did speak. But the fact is that in the Netherlands, as I pointed out in an open letter to their rector, 75% of the Netherlands Jews were exterminated. Why? Because the Judenrat was extremely efficient in compiling statistics of every single Jew, in particular in Amsterdam, where hardly any Jews survived, incidentally. Utrecht, for instance, something like 40% did. But overall in the Netherlands, 75% were extermination. That was because the Judenrat was able to function almost without any challenge. Take the case of France, 75% of Jews survived because the power of the Judenrat, which the Nazis established, simply wasn't there. They didn't have control, and Jews disregarded them. or in Belgium, where 50 to 60% of Jews survived, the resistance, which was led by the communists and the left, actively targeted them. Robert Holzinger, the chief of the Judenrat, was executed by the resistance. They terrorised them into being able to do nothing. And similarly in the Warsaw Ghetto, if the Warsaw Ghetto resistance hadn't executed and assassinated members of the Judenrat and the Jewish police, they would never have been able to mount the revolt. That was a precondition. So one can make many excuses, of course, as Zionists do, because their people were the ones in the Judenrat. But the fact remains, they were a hostile bourgeois force within. They levied taxes on the poor to feed those even less rich. The Jewish masses hated them, and I don't think, the Zionists sympathised with them. And that's why they never agreed and refused to publish Raoul Hilberg's destruction of the European Jews. Raoul Hilberg was the greatest Holocaust historian, because they have a particular version of Holocaust history which Hilberg wasn't prepared to go along with.
Remind people to.
I'm just going to send around a couple of donation buckets as well. Thank you.
And then you're going to say about choose an option.
Oh yeah. So apparently you can choose an option on these. You can go for, if you put your email address down, you can go for either going on the AAW, the Action Against War website, newsletter, or the CPSC, or both.
For its mailing list.
Mailing list, that's the word.
And no need to fill it out if we already have your details.
No need to fill it out if we already have your details.
Can I ask a question?
Any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I just, on the same subject.
Okay. Can you tell us the story of those two Slovak Jews who escaped Auschwitz, and how the history of the Hungarian Jews could have been different? I think it's on the same line, but I think it's a very interesting story. And what happened then when they immigrated to Israel? How were they treated in Israel? How he, I think, who?
Yeah.
Well, there's a webinar on very much on that subject on the 12th of this month, which I've organised. And Tom Suarez is speaking, Chaim Bereshit is speaking, I'm speaking, and one other person who I can't remember is speaking. So I advise you to tune into that. It's on my blog. Again, the details of how to register. Quite simply, on April the 10th, 1944, Rudolf Verber and Alfred Wexler escaped from Auschwitz. Jonathan Friedland, for those who know of him, the Guardian Zionist gatekeeper, has written the book, which really is just a cheap imitation thriller. But if you read Verber's own I Escaped from Auschwitz, or I Cannot Forgive is in the subtitle, you'll find it far more worthwhile. They escaped from Auschwitz, and after a perilous journey they reached Slovakia 2 weeks later. They set down what they knew, the details of Auschwitz, because before then Auschwitz was thought of as a labour camp, not an extermination camp, although it should have been discovered much earlier, but there was no interest amongst the Allies in doing so, quite the contrary. They became known either as the Verber-Wexler Report or the Auschwitz Protocols. They were handed to, amongst others, Rudolf Kastner, who was the leader of Hungarian Zionism. But Kastner was in negotiation with Eichmann to reach a deal which was a safe train out of Hungary for the Zionists and the Jewish elite, the rich Jews and the Zionists and the few Orthodox Jews, in return for which they would keep silent about the destination of the deportation trains. In fact, they would help with the rounding up and the misinforming of them that they were going to a place called Kenya Mays, which didn't exist, a resettlement camp. So when Kastner came to Israel, he was subject to various allegations from survivors of Auschwitz who'd been told or misinformed and Kastner was forced to sue. He was a senior government official who was on the MAPI election list. He was forced to sue in 1954 his detractor Michiel Greenveld, who'd accused him of collaboration. And the Jerusalem District Court in 1955, Benjamin Halevi, found he'd sold his soul to Satan, basically. He lied over one very crucial aspect, which was he went to Nuremberg to testify in favour of a Nazi war criminal, Kurt Becher, who was Hitler's personal emissary in Hungary. The information didn't come out till later that he'd also testified in favour of far more serious war criminals, Dieter Sliceni, who was responsible for the Slovakian, Greek and other deportations, and Hermann Krumie, who'd been Eichmann's second in charge in Hungary, because Hungary was the last remaining significant Jewish community, over 500,000. And because of this failure to warn the Hungarian Jews, 437,000 were deported to Auschwitz, the majority of whom died, 80-90%. But the justification by Zionist historians like Yehuda Bohr, who's just died, was that even if Hungarian Jews had been informed, they wouldn't have assimilated, it wouldn't have become knowledge, because they wouldn't have done anything about it. There's a lot of evidence from people who did get the knowledge that they didn't go on the trains, they refused, they hid. So it's not sustainable. But anyway, that is another debate about Zionist Holocaust historiography, because the Zionists on the one hand maintain they led the resistance, on the other hand they defend the collaborationist movement, which was the Judenrat, so they have a difficulty in squaring that circle. But that in summary is what it was. But I'm quite happy to take other questions as long as you're happy to stay here.
There's this one person.
Yes.
Thank you, first of all, for coming here, and also the work at Inflection Point, most important time. Just to inquire further on the kind of racism of Zionism itself, you touched on the contempt and disdain Zionists had for persecuted Jews, as you said, the ones that were ghettoized, and I heard of a phenomenon within like Israel now that they actually have an enormous amount of contempt and disdain for Jews who had been persecuted during the Holocaust and who had died, dismissing them, casting them as weak Jews, so to say. So I was wondering what you knew about that, or the veracity of that, because I'm also curious, about the impact of Zionism on Israel's own kind of caste system within Jews there, with say like Ashkenazi Jews being more privileged and offered the higher jobs in civil society, as opposed to say Sephardic Jews. Because then fundamentally I'd like to say, what do you believe really actually separates, what fundamentally separates, if anything, Ben Gurion from Ben Gvir? Like, what is it about what is it about Zionism that can glue together, I guess, more secular, labor-orientated views and, I suppose, religious, fundamentalist, expansionist, ethno-nationalist? Thank you.
Why do we take more than one question?
Okay, anyone else?
Thank you. A quick question just regarding the beginning of Zionism and like in the 1800s. You know, I've heard people talk about the creation of the state of Israel in different places, such as Uganda. I don't know, is this true? And can you tell me more about that?
One more question? Yeah.
Just a simple quickie. Why did the Allies ever bomb the rail lines into death camps when they were capable of doing it and were doing it, and it came up? Has that ever been cleared up?
Can we take one more question, Tony?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You said that the Zionism, the origins of it was supported by anti-Semitism. Which do you believe is supporting Zionism the most now in modern politics? Is it anti-Semitism or is it the foothold in the Middle East? Thank you.
Okay, you asked, the first question was what to glues, or what is the identity between Ben Gvir and Ben Gurion? Someone asked that. Zionism has always portrayed itself as being a multifaceted organisation movement, which had a left wing and a right wing. I mean, the most left-wing party, Mapam, used to call itself Marxist, and it was the second major party in the Knesset in 1949, the first elections. Today it's disappeared entirely. The Labour Party have 4 out of 120 seats, whereas until 1977 they controlled the government of Israel with absolute majorities in the coalition, but they had 40 to 50 seats. What I would say is that Labour Zionism, which believed in collective colonialisation via kibbutzim and so on, because it was the most efficient method of colonisation, has disappeared as a model. There is no longer any necessity for it. But it laid the basis for everything that's happening now. I mean, the Nakba took place under the Labour Zionists, not the revisionist Zionists. The conquest of the West Bank took place under the Labour Zionists. They began the first settlements. So there was no principal difference between the Labour Zionists and the right-wing Zionists. They both agree on a Jewish supremacist state. They may disagree on tactics, but then within Likud there are disagreements on tactics. Netanyahu just fired Galant, so I mean, there's no amount of differences, but it's within a very narrow spectrum. So I mean, that's my answer. Yes, of course, there are differences within the Jewish population. There are the poor whites, if you like, the Sephardic, the Arab Jews, and so on. The most oppressed of all are the Ethiopian Jews, but you know, they're also the most anti-Palestinian because it's what happened in the Deep South. The most oppressed whites look down on the blacks who are even more oppressed. So the progressive potential is not there. I mean, there have been progressive movements, but they've died away amongst the Sephardic. So that's my answer to you, that Zionism basically has a commonality, an agreement. This is a Jewish state, and if it's a Jewish state, then in the words of Yair Lapid, who's the most moderate so-called left-wing leader in Israel today, his idea of a Jewish state is maximum Jews, maximum land, fewest Palestinians. And if he says that, I mean, what do you think the right wing say? On the Uganda, Zionism, Jewish political Zionism really began with the founding of the First Zionist Congress in 1897. There were proto-Zionist movements beforehand. There was the 1881, I think, foundation of Chavavei Zion, the Lovers of Zionism, by a guy called Leo Pinsker, who is notable for his saying that what is Judeophobia? Because he was a doctor, so he called it by a medical term, and he said anti-Semitism or Judeophobia is hereditary, and having been inherited for 2,000 years, it's incurable. And that was identical throughout the history of Zionism. This belief that anti-Semitism was an incurable disease. They established the first settlements in Palestine, but it was called the First Aliyah. But up till 1904, they were sponsored by people like Baron Edmund Rothschild, Rishon LeZion, Petach Tikva was the first. They tended to become like traditional planter settlements. It was the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association. So they employed Arabs as cheap labour. And the Zionists of the second Aliyah, the Labour Zionist Aliyah, were fiercely opposed to this. They had the policy of Jewish labour, Jewish land, Jewish produce. What Jewish labour meant was that you boycott Arab labour. They picketed out orange groves which employed Arabs. No Jewish employer could get away with employing an Arab. So they created an apartheid economy within the British mandate as a precursor to their apartheid state. Jewish labour was their watchword and was a separate charge for Histadrut trade union members, specifically to support the boycott of Arab labour. So that's where it really developed. When you mention Uganda, there's a controversy within the Zionist movement. I didn't really want to go into it. It was in 1903 when Joseph Chamberlain offered Uganda, the White Highlands, it was actually in Kenya, as a temporary resting place, as it were. But it was a fierce controversy in the Zionist movement, and although the Congress approved it narrowly, in practice it was dead. So I won't go into it anymore. It's really a separate episode. Why didn't the Allies bomb the railway lands and actually Auschwitz itself, which by 1944 was the only major extermination camp, in fact the only extermination camp? Well, the answer is quite simple. Their priorities were to win the war. They weren't concerned about who perished in an extermination camp. Was really beside the point. British intelligence knew of the concentration camps and the final solution far, far earlier and kept that information very secret and very hidden because it didn't fit in with their war plans. I mean, the British ruling class fought Hitler not because they were anti-fascist, because Hitler had threatened their interest in Eastern Europe. If you remember, going back to the Hossbach Protocol of 1937, when Hitler explained to his senior generals that Germany would treat Eastern Europe as the equivalent of Britain's India. In other words, Germany would attack and conquer and colonise Eastern Europe in the same way that Britain had colonised created its empire in Asia and Africa. That was their policy, but Britain didn't agree because it had major interests also in those countries, hence the conflict, hence why British leaders, war leaders like Churchill, Lloyd George, who was an avid Hitler fan, had started off praising Hitler and then came around to opposing him because British interests and his collided, as is often the case. So that's in short why they didn't bomb the railway camps. I should add that the Zionist, the Jewish agency, opposed the bombing until very late of the extermination camps. Its initial decision was they wouldn't support a call for its bombing, but they later reversed that position. The final question is, who is supporting Zionism now? Are they anti-Semites, or is it a question of gaining a foothold in the Middle East? Well, both, I guess. I mean, what would you call Donald Trump, who believes that the real state of Jewish people lies not in America but in Palestine, in Israel? I mean, he's anti-Semitic, he's racist in every sense, but he's a true supporter of Israel. So I don't think there's a counter-position between the two because they go hand in hand. You may not love Jews, but you do love Israel. That's as simple as it is, really. Anyone else? Got a question? Or have I exhausted you?
Any other questions? Yeah. So.
Given the genocide that is going on, and given the unconditional support of America, irrespective of the change in presidency, what do you see the future being for what's going on? Do you see any potential solution for people suffering in the West Bank and Gaza? Do you see any potential positive outcomes of any kind?
Can you come down here?
Hi, Tony. right, thanks for the presentation, it was very good. I think you posed the question when you were concluding as to how we use this historical background to influence governments. I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that, but that would be of interest. Thank you.
Sorry, what was the question?
I think you posed the question as to how we would use this historical background to influence our governments and have our voice heard, I suppose. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, we'll take two and go forth.
Hello. So I'm Croatian, and I know you were mentioning before a little bit about Croatia. It's something that I actually learned just recently, with the Ustasha. And I kind of like, in these modern days, I find it very interesting because we're having a rise of Ustasha again in Croatia. And we're having a rise in Nazism around Europe. And it's very funny because it's so, how would I say, it's so hand to hand with the Zionism, while in the last century it would be kind of opposite, if I'm saying this correct. So I guess the question is, what are your thoughts on this change in this modern era?
Hi, how are you doing?
Yeah.
Thanks very much for the talk. In relation to your book, you referenced a few other, I suspect, German or European authors about events and during the Holocaust, and you mentioned Judenrat. Are those references in your book? Okay, that's good to know. And if you look at the world today, who do you think have replaced the Jews in the world? When I'm referring to the Jews, I'm referring to the Jews of the early 20th century.
Thank you.
Thanks. To the first question, yes, we're in the middle of a genocide, and it's absolutely clear that Israel wants to partition Gaza and to clear the north of Gaza of all Palestinians, and it's prepared to kill untold numbers, and that's a fact. There's been talk of them declaring the 400,000 there as terrorists to be shot on sight. They've destroyed every hospital, of course every school and every mosque and so on. This is part of Western values. What is the potential solution? I don't have an easy one. If I had, I would gladly give it to you. I suppose what I'm saying is, in a sense, that the Palestinian struggle is part of a wider struggle in the Middle East against imperialism's agents, and that includes the client Arab regimes which are keyed into the petrodollar economy. In essence, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf invest heavily in the Western economies to keep them afloat, and they're integrated into the world capitalist economy. So there is a struggle there for the Arab peoples, because unlike South Africa, there is a basic parity of numbers between Palestinians and the greater Israel and Jews. So, and given the enormous armaments in the hands of the Zionists, simply a military struggle, I don't think is going to overcome it. So it is also a wider social struggle as well. Of course, Israel has been seen to be weakened as a result of what is happening. It's taken heavy losses in the south of Lebanon. It's found it extremely difficult going in Gaza itself, and America has had to come to its aid, and not only America, Britain, but if you like, the solution will be part of a wider struggle to get rid of the Sisis, the King Husseins, the MBSs in Saudi Arabia, and all the other sheikhs and emirs that dot the place, who keep the wealth of the region from the people of the region. Of that there is no doubt, but when it will happen and in what form it will take, And whether there'll be another Arab Spring is not something I obviously have a crystal ball for, so that's how I see the situation anyway. Second question is, how do we use the historical background to influence governments? Well, I don't think the historical background will influence governments because, let us face it, the British government adopted Zionism before the British Jews did. I mean, that was its established policy, and the United States has done similarly. You know, I mean, after '67, it was fully in support of Israel, and you know, however, whatever Israel has done in Gaza is what the United States did in Vietnam, for example, and other places. So, I mean, such barbarities are not new to imperialism. Iraq, where they killed 1 million people, etc. I mean, these things happen, and when they get exposed, as with Julian Assange, then the person who does the exposure gets locked up rather than the war criminals. That is just how it is. The purpose of writing my book was not to influence any governments. Obviously, I'm happy to influence individuals, but to inform the Palestine Solidarity movement. They should not be frightened or deterred by accusations of anti-Semitism, and it's those who make the accusation who have most in common with the anti-Semites. So, I mean, that's my purpose. I mean, whether I succeed or not, I don't know, but I do my best insofar as I'm able to lay out the history of what happened, as opposed to the false history that we read about every day in the papers, that if you're anti-Israel, you're therefore anti-Jewish. I mean, that's the common message, certainly in Britain. I don't know quite what it's like in Ireland. Maybe you have a better press, I don't know. I don't know. Seriously, I don't know. On the Ustache, well, yes, I mean, the Ustache were vehemently anti-Semitic, although, as Hannah Arendt pointed out, many of the senior leaders of the Ustache government in Croatia were married to people who were half Jewish, so they weren't considered trustworthy either. It was a fascist movement, what can I say? Why is it reoccurring in Europe today? Well, I think you're having a swing to the far right. We've got elections in Germany. I suspect the Alternative for Germany, AfD, which is vehemently pro-Zionist, pro-Israel, but is also riddled with Holocaust deniers, is going to do very well. I could spend half an hour on the collapse of the socialist and left movements, the disappearance of the Communist Party from Italy, from France, and from so on. I mean, we have seen a decline in working class politics for whatever reason, and that's manifested itself in, if you like, the rise of the new authoritarian right. I don't think it's a recurrence of fascism in the old form, the Deuce or the leader, the Führer. It is a different form. I mean, it's an authoritarian right at times, but it's very different, not least because fascism was originally predicated on destruction of the working class movement. I mean, Hitler rose to power on anti-Bolshevism. He didn't rise to power on anti-Semitism. He played that down between 1930 and 1933. So whatever we're seeing now with Trump, with Nigel Farage in Britain, I don't know whether you have any equivalent in Ireland, but certainly in Europe there's Sweden, which was a kind of role model for social democracy. Olof Palme, when I was young, has now swiveled to the right. You are seeing those movements, and the left has got to get its act together. But I don't have any recipes, at least none that I'm going to divulge today. Finally, references. Yes, everything's referenced in my book, so you should be able to go to them quite easily. Jews today, well, Prima Levi is reported to have said that the Palestinians are the Jews of Israel, so work that one out for yourself, because that is the reality, isn't it?
He never said that. He never said that. He never said that. He's reported.
Yeah, that's what I said, reported.
Yeah.
He said something very similar.
Yeah, but I would have said that today, for sure. He would have.
Yes, I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Mm.
Yeah. Is there anyone else who's burning to ask a question?
Okay, last question.
9 o'clock.
Thank you very much. In 2018, I think it was, the Jewish Voice for Peace made a historic decision to recognize that they couldn't be against occupation and still see Israel as a democratic state. And so, from my understanding and reading, they became an anti-Zionist organization of Jews. And I'm just wondering if you could, if you have information or you'd like to say, are similar movements such as that in other parts of the world, in Europe? I mean, what is the hope for Jews themselves to see that the right place is to be anti-Zionist? And yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? No. Sorry, just looking for a clarification, Tony. Earlier on, someone asked you a question about two-state solution, and you mentioned how you parted ways with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in Britain because they had endorsed the Oslo Accords, but you didn't really develop your own attitude towards a two-state solution. You might just do that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Jewish Voice for Peace did adopt an anti-Zionist position in 2018. I think most Jewish organisations which are active on Palestine face that question sooner or later, if they're going to be relevant. I think Jewish Voice for Labour in Britain, I mean Jewish Network for Palestine, which is anti-Zionist, but there are some which still say that they're non-Zionist in an effort to keep a foothold within the Jewish community. But to be quite honest, Jewish communities are not the reason why the West adopts the attitudes it does to Israel. They're the excuse, the moral alibi, if you like, for their position. So it's quite clear, even if you were to win over the Jewish communities, it wouldn't affect British imperialism support for Israel as a state. But also the reality is that Jewish identity has changed. I mean, 100 years ago, when you thought of someone who was a Jewish, you would think of someone who was a working class militant, a socialist, a communist, etc. Churchill's essay of 1921, Bolshevism or Zionism, posed it very clearly. I mean, that's either Jews could go down one road or another. That isn't the case now. Jewish communities tend to be right-wing. Their identification with Israel has pulled them in that direction. But also they've climbed the ladder socio-economically. So they're very different now. I mean, they're white. They don't suffer from racism, because anti-Semitism is at best a marginal prejudice. It may be different in some parts of Eastern Europe, but it's certainly not the case in the West. As for two states, I thought I'd made my position crystal clear. But
to develop a little bit why you...
Why? Well, because a two-state solution, even if it came about, which it won't, because the Knesset's just voted by 68 to 9, I think, to reject it, the idea of a two-state solution. But Zionism is an inherently expansionist settler colonial state. And settler colonials aren't in the habit of giving back what they've stolen. So there's no reason at all. I mean, the messianic madmen of the West Bank, whose dream is of building the third temple so they can once again perform animal sacrifices and thereby encourage the Messiah to return, very much like the Christian idea of Jesus' return. I mean, they're really two sides of the same coin. Do you really think they're going to say, oh yes, we'll have a special place for the Palestinians? No, of course not. I mean, and they're the ones who are growing stronger. As if you like, the secular Jews would grow weaker. I mean, that's the nature of Israel. I mean, if it wasn't for the Palestinians, Israel would have had a civil war already. But what happens eventually, who knows? I don't have a crystal ball. But two states is simply a non-starter. But even if it was possible, it would still leave an apartheid, racist, Jewish state in place. So from that point of view, I'd reject it anyway.
But what about the other side of the coin, the PA? Could you just say something about
The
that?
Palestinian Authority?
Yeah, and PLO.
Well, I mean, the Palestinian Authority is a quisling authority. I mean, it's a collaborationist authority. It's still arresting people from the resistance and handing them over to Israel. I mean, it's completely discredited in the occupied territories. I mean, Mahmoud Abbas has less than 10% support amongst the people. It's armed and equipped and trained by Israel, by America, and Europe to a lesser extent, but it has a raise of credibility. It doesn't even control Ramallah, its capital. Israel goes in and out at will to close down Palestinian organisations like Al Jazeera recently. So two states simply isn't on the horizon, and no one seriously thinks it is either. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, so just to be clear, I guess, what you had said on that panel is that, you know, activist groups who advocate or pay any kind of lip service to the two-state solution are effectively undermining their own argument. That was the thing I was trying to get across, is that we need to completely bin the two-state solution in our activism. So, thank you very much, everybody. If anybody wants their books signed by Tony, I would say he'd be more than happy to do so. Thank you all for coming.